Thank you. I now call on the Acting Prime Minister and Attorney General and Minister for Economy, Civil Service, Communications, Housing and Community Development, the Honourable iTaukei. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, sir, I did, when I looked at this question, I did ask Honourable Lavera yesterday what specifically did he want, because if you look at the question itself, sir, it talks about what are the arrangements in place for the administration of gazetted villages. The arrangements in place, Mr. Speaker, sir, of course, are under the iTaukei Affairs Act. And under the Act, there are numerous pieces of regulations. So they start off with the iTaukei Affairs Provincial Council regulations, iTaukei Affairs Tikina and Village Council regulations, iTaukei Affairs Board regulations, iTaukei Affairs Declaration of iTaukei Settlements as iTaukei Villages, with the bylaws of 2010, and of course the iTaukei Affairs Boundaries regulation that go back to 1966. And then you have the different provincial councils and different provinces that have their own public health bylaws that were put in place, most of them in 1969. So all of those are there, and that's what actually administers it. If he said to me that we have not updated them and it's time for a review. The latest one, Mr. Speaker, sir, which obviously has been an issue which I'd like to highlight, specifically to go to the villages themselves, the village confirmation gazetting, of course, Mr. Speaker, sir, has been going on since 1894. Currently there are 1,171 registered villages. And Mr. Speaker, sir, out of those villages, there has been 1,151 have been demarcated, with 657 villages gazetted. 494 villages were approved by the board for gazetting at its last meeting on 31 November 2021, just a few months back, with the remaining 20 awaiting the consents of the land-owning units. I think, Mr. Speaker, sir, perhaps Honourable Member was concerned about the number of informal settlements and how they actually become villages. And if I could just read out to him, and this is a regulation that was put in place in 2010, as we know, a lot of these settlements are now becoming quite large. The board shall have the power to register iTaukei settlements to be a village. When assessing an iTaukei settlement's suitability for registration as a village, the board must ensure that A. Proposed site must be on iTaukei land within the land boundary of its parent Yavusa. B. Proposed village must be sited on iTaukei land, and where a majority of the members of the landowning unit of the land concerned has agreed to surrender in the traditional manner ownership rights to such land, which would, after the registration, be owned communally by the new village. C. Inhabitants of the village are from the Yavusa and have recognized and accepted a leader of the new village. D. New village, when registered, will be the new village of the inhabitants and will be accepted for such purpose for all official transactions, including Yuvolani Kawambula. We shall go through the processes as required by written law. The new village will also be registered as such by the iTaukei Lands Commission. E. Site has been certified by the health authorities to be posing no threat to the health of the inhabitants and that it has a reliable source of fresh water. F. Site has been certified by the Director of the Disaster Management Office as safe from natural hazards such as flooding, landslides or erosions. And G. Request for registration must be made in writing with the endorsement and support of the relevant Tikina and Provincial Council. And H. The boundaries of the proposed village has been demarcated by the iTaukei Lands Commission. Mr. Speaker, sir, this is obviously a growing issue as we've seen many villages that have become large. What is also critically important, sir, is that a lot of these, as you know, that the law was amended under the Beni Marama government, that those people who live in villages and are actually under the VKB and have the right to have access to the land, they can now actually withdraw the FNPF funds. So they can withdraw up to 50% to build their home in the village. Because before it was not allowed for them to be able to access those funds. So now they can take out that money, build their homes. So it is critically important that those settlements that actually want to be classified as villages go through this process so they can also take out the money from FNPF and build their own homes. Because the theory behind it, of course, and it is obviously in practice, that if you are a member of the VKB in that particular Yavusa, nobody can take away their land from you because you communally have ownership of the land. So that's one of the recent amendments that were, regulations that were put in place in 2010 to be able to facilitate that. Mr. Speaker, sir, if the honourable member is talking about the relevance, in fact, I don't know how many members of the opposition have actually read this particular set of regulations. It's very, very extensive. Of course, some of it goes back to 1960s. But in fact, if you look at it, Mr. Speaker, sir, you have, for example, each province has its own village bylaws. All of them go back to 1969. So you have the Namosi Province Public Health Villages Bylaws 1969, Naranga, Novosa, everywhere else has it. There are certain provisions now, Mr. Speaker, sir, in these regulations that perhaps is no longer applicable to those villages that already have now access to water and sanitation that did not have access to previously. So they talk about latrines. If you go to a lot of the villages, and I'm not saying no village has latrines anymore, there are obviously some villages with latrines, but a number of the villages don't actually have latrines. So obviously that's not applicable to them. There are various issues, for example, cleaning of villages. It says, each occupier of a house shall be responsible for cleaning an area within a radius of 1.9 meters around his or her dwelling house, kitchen, dining house, if any, and latrine, and for keeping such area free from refuse, rubbish, and offensive matter, and receptacles wherein mosquitoes may breed, and the provincial council shall take such responsible steps as may be necessary to ensure the taking of similar measures in the remaining area of each village, provided that if the area of responsibility of one of the occupier extends into the area of responsibility of another occupier, each occupier shall be responsible for cleaning that half of the common area nearest to his or her building. Quite prescriptive. But in practical terms, some of it may not necessarily happen. So, this is up to, obviously, the different provinces to decide. But in terms of relevance, some of it may no longer be relevant because different villages have access to utilities now that did not have access to previously. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. We will move on.